Any tourist who is visiting France, if he or she doesn't know about Louis XIV, he would have to listen to the name again and again and again.
Mm,
He was a big builder.
mm.
So I thought that this book either should be dedicated to Louis XIV or the title should somehow catch any of the elements of his life.
So, hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Book Cafe podcast. My guest for today's episode is Dr. Mahbubur Rahman, and the book that we're going to be discussing is this one right here behind me, entitled L'état c'est moi. So, it's a fascinating book for a couple of reasons. The first being that this book isn't actually available in English at this point in time. It's a Bengali language book with a French title. So, we'll be dealing with three different languages today: a book written in Bengali, a discussion in English, and a title in French. So, first and foremost, Dr. Mahbub Rahman, welcome to the show. It's really great to connect with you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Mahbub bhai, right at the beginning, I have to make a confession that we are not strangers to each other. We know each other from North South University, where we both did our MBA together. I know you as a doctor and a business grad, but now you've also become a writer. So you have to tell us about your life story, because I'm sure that it is just as fascinating as the book that you've written.
Well, in shortly, I could say that my life is full of experiments, and I have really enjoyed it throughout my life. It's full of transitions. Regarding my educational background, I did my HSC from Notre Dame College in Dhaka back in
Mm,
1992.
mm,
After that, I have always dreamed of becoming a mathematician, and whatever I write, if you have a keen eye, you'd very easily find that this person is a math nerd.
mm,
And according to my father's wishes, I joined medical school, which was
mm,
the first major turning point in my life. Against my will, I left Dhaka, which was at that time very shocking for me. I went to a northern small district town, Bogura.
mm,
After completing my MBBS, I quit medicine. That's the second transition. I joined the pharmaceutical industry. I started with Aventis Bangladesh Limited, which was at
mm,
that time the biggest MNC in our country. So I kept going on with pharma industry like for 21 years. And
mm,
during the last part of my tenure, I started working with this book. I mean, I was working and I was writing. One certain period, I understood that if the book is a serious work, so it deserves full attention. So
mm,
I quit my job, which
mm.
was, I could say, very lucrative, and still people think it's like a madman's work. From
Absolutely. So, Mahbhai, thank you so much for sharing your fascinating life story. And I think I need to explain to my audience that you're one of the very few people or friends that I have whom I would categorize as genius level intellect. And I don't mean it in any small way. I think that what you've managed to achieve, going from one career to another, is absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate life stories where, as I like to tell our audience, that in Bangladesh most of the time we have our parents who guide us in our careers into safe careers. You know, you have to become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer where you have a safe job, a safe monthly income. But for you to actually go out of this box, somebody who has a background in medicine and business, to actually go and leave all of that and write a book about a completely different country,
different.
France. Exactly. Maubay, let's come to the title of the book. So it's called L'état c'est moi, and it means I am the state. So in Bangla, I think we say je ami rashtra, right? So tell us why you picked this to be the title of the book. Help us understand that.
Any tourist who is visiting France, if he or she doesn't know about Louis XIV, as they say in French, Louis XIV, doesn't matter because every tourist place he or she goes, he would have to listen to the name again and again and again.
Mm,
He was a big builder, and most of the things we see in France, the man behind the creation is Louis XIV.
mm,
So I thought that this book either should be dedicated to Louis XIV or the title should somehow catch any of the elements of his life. So
mm,
I thought that the Leta Semoa is the, you could say, most famous quote of his life and the most famous transition of his life. It happened in 1661.
mm.
He had a prime minister, Cardinal Mazarin.
Mazarin, right?
He was Italian,
Mm,
and throughout all his life, whenever any bureaucrat used to take firm decisions for the country, that's not always popular. People used to
mm.
say that he is a foreign thief. People used to call him, he was a foreign thief.
Mm,
So after the death of the prime minister, Louis XIV stopped hiring prime minister and he took away the power of the bureaucrats. He took
mhm,
away the power of the every ministry. He said
mhm.
everything will go on by my authorization, my signature, every single paper. So he said that from now on, I am the state. So
That
that was
is,
my
wow.
inspiration for the book.
Mm,
And
absolutely. I pride myself in my knowledge of history, and I knew that this was uttered by Louis the 14th, but I didn't know the background.
Cardinal
Yeah,
Mazarin was his teacher also,
his teacher. Yeah.
because he
Yeah.
didn't have his father. The father died, Louis
Mm,
XIII
right.
died in his early age. So
Mm,
he became emperor at a
mm,
very
mm,
early age. Like he was not full five at that time. You could say four and a half when
mm,
he became emperor.
right.
And the regent, Reggio in France,
Mm-hmm.
was his mother and
Mm-hmm.
combined with the prime minister. Cardinal
His house,
Mazarin
yeah.
was a very important person in his life, and in his youth, he fell in love with his niece.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to marry her,
Okay.
but the
Yeah.
Mazarin and the mother, Anne of Austria, they
Mm-hmm.
both were very rigid on this topic because, at those times, in even today, the royal marriages, they are not personal choice.
Mhm. Yes, they're basically arranged marriages, arranged for political alliances. Yes, that's wonderful. Mahapai, there's one more thing that we need to discuss with regards to Louis XIV, and that is, of course, his estate in Versailles. Can you tell us? And of course, Versailles is a couple of hours outside of Paris, and I've really seen a lot of your photos on Facebook where you visited Versailles. My wife Jennifer and I also had the privilege of visiting Versailles a couple of years ago, and the first thing that struck me was that it is such a very beautiful estate with a huge garden. So, did Louis actually have an affinity or did he enjoy having huge gardens?
Uh, I could say that gardening was a tradition of, even at the time of Louis XIV, it was a tradition of like 300 years
Hmm.
in France.
Right.
And the inspiration came from Italy because the Italian gardens were so beautiful.
Hmm.
And in Florence, there's a garden. There's a garden made by Medici family, which is very close to the palace of the Medicis. And there was two famous queens from the
Hmm.
Medici family.
Hmm.
One was the queen of Henry II,
Henri the
Henri
second.
II in French, and Henri IV.
Okay.
They both were from Medici family, and what they brought with them was the tradition of Italian garden. Later on, the French emperors, they became more and more interested about the garden. Among them was Louis XIV. And what he was interested, he wanted a French garden.
Hmm.
And his gardener was Audrey Lonot. Audrey Lonot was by generation gardener. His father was a gardener, his grandfather was a gardener, and all of them, they worked for the royal families. I mean, they served kings for two generations, and Audre Lorde was the third, and he was the most brilliant gardener. They actually use a word landscape architect
Hmm.
for Audre
Hmm.
Lorde
Right.
because it's not about some plants. He also had to change the whole landscape for the garden. So he was a landscape architect. And there's a famous saying about Louis XIV by Audre Lorde that Louis XIV was the best gardener he knows.
Hmm.
So that is one of the secrets of the Garden of Versailles.
Hmm. Wow, that's amazing. And is there a history behind why he changed the capital from Paris to Versailles? So was he trying to escape something, Maubai? Can you tell us about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There was a popular movement against a heavy tax imposed on the landlords.
Hmm.
And later on, the landlords and the parliamentarians both became united, and the aristocracy of France, they joined the movement, fraud in French, which
Hmm.
is a sling, like a sling carried by David Michelangelo.
Hmm.
Why did they call it sling? Because the mob used to throw stones at the glass windows of the royal families and their relatives and so on. So the movement was named fraud in French. The mob attacked the palace, Palais Royal. He was
Hmm.
at that night. He was in Palais Royal, and the mob entered the bedroom. Louis XIV pretended that he was sleeping. He was very small. He was very frightened. He thought that they are going to end his life right now.
Hmm.
So they spared him, and that panic never left him. He
Hmm.
thought that the I have to go far away from the people of France. So he thought that if I take away the center of power, the power of my enemy will be reduced, and
Hmm.
in my playground I will set them.
Oh, fascinating. Wow. In my playground, I will set them. That is amazing. So I can see that Louis was actually quite brilliant in moving the capital away from Paris so that he would be safer. He would have control over everything, who comes in, who comes out. Fascinating. Let's end with one last point about Louis XIV's Mao Bhai before we move on to the next section. And that is about a very famous painting of Louis that I think a lot of us have seen, where he is dressed in full regalia. But there's something interesting about that photo, which you told me a couple of days last week, in fact, while we were having coffee. Would you mind telling us, for the benefit of our audience, what is it about that particular picture that is a bit off or that is a bit different from what we see as the final product? So tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. The painting, it has three versions. The
Mm-hmm.
painting had three versions, the portrait of Louis XIV, and the painting was done by Hyacinthe Rigaud.
Mm-hmm.
Louis XIV, he had a grandchild, was nominated as a king of Spain. But the problem was, if a Spanish king is by origin French, which means after a couple of years, French and Spain will become united and will become the biggest
Will be this
power
year,
in
right?
Europe. No
Yeah.
other power in Europe
Mm-hmm.
was, happy with that. So the grandchild was about to move for Spain. He said that I want to take a portrait of my grandfather who is so dear to me. So Yasin Rigo was commissioned to
Mm-hmm.
paint picture of Louis XIV. And what happened? The aristocrats and other painters, they appreciated the painting hugely. So Louis XIV thought that I should keep it for my own.
Mm-hmm.
So he kept the painting for his own. Later on, another version was painted. So two versions. One is kept in Louvre Museum. One is kept in Louvre Museum vault, and there is one in the Versailles Palace in the grand state apartments. And
Mhm.
within the painting, you would say he was carrying a stick. There is a tool on which there is the velvet
Mhm.
uh, cloth that is stitched to imprint the fleur de lis, which is
Mhm.
the royal
Right.
symbol of the Bourbon
Mhm.
dynasty. Just behind him, there is a big Tuscan column. Column is so big, so huge. It represents the power of Louis XIV. That look, my power in the throne is like this column. You cannot move it. Try to push it,
Mhm.
but you are in no condition to push it away. So my power is like that. Regarding his dress, there's a tie-like piece of cloth around the neck,
Mhm.
hanging over his chest, which is in French is called cravat,
Mhm.
which was the, could say, precursor of modern necktie, which
Mhm.
we use.
Yeah.
And it happened in actually England after the takeover of Oliver Cromwell. There was a practice of modesty, modesty
Mhm.
in food, modesty in expense, and modesty in clothes.
Mhm.
So instead of cravat, they started using a small cloth,
Mhm.
which later became the necktie
The
that
necktie.
we
Wow.
use today.
Amazing.
And over his shoulder, there's a
Mhm.
big piece of clothes still in use in modern days that is called cape, C-A-P-E. And cape is a like a symbol of power. If you look at Batman, he has a cape over his shoulder. Batman is a strong person. Try to fight him, but you can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. But you missed out on one thing, Mao Bhai, and that is to do with the stockings on his legs, and in fact, the legs itself. So, can you tell us about that?
The leg, the leg that is shown as Louis XIV's leg actually was a cover up. It was the leg of a dancer, and
Wow.
Louis XIV
Mm,
was a, you could say, very skilled dancer.
mm,
He used to dance publicly in the festivals, and even he took part in operas, like he took part in the role of a dancer. He was a beautiful dancer. And one thing I might mention that it's an interesting fact that Louis XIV, he died of gangrene. So
wow.
they were about to amputate his leg, but later on it was postponed. Treatment at that time, they used to do bloodletting. I mean, take away like a bag of blood from
Mm,
the sick person. They thought that these bloods are poisoned, and if you take away the sick person becomes better. So with that belief, they used to take away lots of blood from Louis XIV.
mm,
Later on, they found that the diagnosis is wrong. He was
mm.
suffering from gangrene and he died.
Well, as a doctor, I'm sure you must really sympathize with the doctors of that age who didn't have the diagnostic tools that we have today to be able to figure out, what happened. So, Mahbubur, thank you so much for that amazing and fascinating discussion about Louis XIV. So, let's move on to another prominent historical figure. So, and he's one of my favorites, Leonardo da Vinci. We know that he's an Italian and he painted the famous Mona Lisa, which is now in the Louvre Museum in Paris. But how did the Mona Lisa and Leonardo end up in France? Tell us about that. How did that happen?
He was genius. There is no doubt about it. He was a Florentine. The village Vinci was not far away from Florence. He stayed more years in Milan than in Florence.
Mhm.
From today's perspective, living in Milan and living in Florence was not same because two a different country. Florence was a different country, Milan was
Yeah,
a different
different
country.
country. Yeah.
So it was like going abroad. The tenure he spent in Florence at the later part. he was bittered with Florence, and Florence was bittered with him.
Wow.
The head of the Medici family at that
Mm.
time, Lorenzo the Magnificent,
Lorenzo the
he was the
Magnificent,
head
yeah.
of the Medici family.
Right.
He was a
Right.
great patron of arts.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was patron of Michelangelo, which is Michelangelo in
Mm-hmm.
Italian.
Right.
He was also patron of Leonardo da Vinci, but
Mm-hmm.
he was very, I could say, he was very disappointed about Vinci because, he couldn't finish his
Mm.
works.
Right.
Whatever was given to him, you could say for sure that he's not going to finish it. So people were
Yes.
annoyed, people were disgusted with him. He was disgusted with Florence. So
Mm.
he thought that I must leave this country.
Right.
Uh, so he made a communication with the Duke of Milan. He immigrated, you could say,
Mm.
immigrated was the proper word for it. He
Right.
immigrated to Milan
Mm-hmm.
and he spent 23 years in Milan. He spent
Mm.
17 years in Florence. He
Mm.
spent 23 years
23
in
in
Milan.
Milan. Wow.
So after the fall of the Duke of Milan, he was looking for new shelters. He traveled to different countries, I should say country,
Mm-hmm.
from his time perspective. He
Mm.
went to Venice. He came back to Florence. And later on, he had an invitation first from the governor of Milan, who was French,
Mm-hmm.
because the French took away Milan.
Mm.
And later
Mm.
on, he was invited by, at that time, you could say French king to stay in Milan and work for him. Later on, a new king came to power, which is Francois First. In English, you could say Francis. He was a very young king, and he was very fond of Leonardo da Vinci. And
Mm.
he invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, and it was like Vinci was waiting for that. He
Mm.
immediately grabbed the invitation,
Invitation,
so
yeah.
he crossed Alps at that time because at that time the journey was not so easy
Mm-hmm.
things. It took 3 months
Yeah.
for him to go to France,
Mm-hmm.
and the capital, I must say, the
Mm.
capital was not in Paris. It
Mm.
was it came to Paris later on,
Later on,
and
yeah.
the
Yeah.
first king who thought that Paris should be the center was this very king,
Mm.
Francois the
Francois.
First.
I see.
So he
Wow.
started building things in Paris and he made Paris the capital. And at that time, he was living in Loire Valley and Vinci, he was invited. He went there.
Mm.
Along with him, he took three paintings,
Right.
and one of them is Mona Lisa.
Mona Lisa.
The another two was John the Baptist, uh, Saint Anne with
Right.
Mary Ann. These three paintings
These
he
three paintings
took
he took.
with him,
Okay.
and later on, the Mona Lisa came back to after the death of Vinci. The Mona Lisa came back to Italy for a small period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, Francis I, he purchased the
Which is
painting,
the painting.
and at that time there was no Louvre Museum,
Right.
so he kept it in his palace.
Mm. I see. So that explains why Leonardo, being an Italian Renaissance man, had his painting, the Mona Lisa, end up in France, in the Louvre Museum where it is today. That's amazing. So you mentioned John the Baptist in your answer, Maubhai, and I have to say that my wife Jennifer is a huge, huge fan of that one particular painting of John the Baptist by Leonardo. So is there anything about that painting that you can tell us, because it's very mystical? So, but do please share your thoughts on that particular
Sure,
painting. Yeah.
sure. Actually, there are two John the Baptist in the
Mm.
Louvre
Right.
by Vinci.
Mm-hmm.
And as for many paintings of Vinci, there are debates about the authorship. I mean, who
Mm.
painted it. There is one John the Baptist against a dark background.
Right.
There is a male figure pointing the index
Mm.
finger towards
Yes,
the
this one.
heaven, towards God.
Mm.
And He has big curly hairs over the shoulder. From the first impression, you could say this is the figure of a female person. They are called effeminate. They are not
Right.
female, but they
Yeah, effeminate.
look like
Yes.
female.
Mm.
One of them is one of the disciples of the Last Supper,
Mm. Yeah.
whom allegedly Dan Brown called Mary Magdalene. I will
Amazing.
come back to John the Baptist, and
Mhm.
there are debates about the authorship of the painting. So, why is the debate? Because at one certain stage of his career, Vinci started to paint human figures in the background is always a landscape.
Mhm.
But in John the Baptist, the background is black.
Mhm. Right.
So there is one point of controversy. Why is that? But the
Mhm.
other points of concordance is that this is painted on a walnut piece of wood. So he used to paint on wood panels at that time. At that time,
Mhm.
he has very few paintings. I could say one painted on canvas at
Mhm.
the early stage of his career. But in
Mhm.
his mature age, all the paintings are in wood panel.
Mhm. Right.
Also, the Mona Lisa, the Madonna of the Rocks, whatever you can imagine, all are
Yeah.
painted on wood
Mm.
panels.
Wood
So,
panels. Yeah.
John the Baptist is on wood panel. There is
Right.
another John the Baptist in the Louvre Museum,
Yeah.
which is later on repainted by one of his disciples, Melzi.
Right.
He was given a stick, and there is a bunch of grapes in his hand. So
Mm.
people used to call it Bacchus, a Greek god of wine.
Mm.
Also, people call it Saint John the Baptist. And in
Mm.
this painting, there is nature behind the
Behind
figure
the
John
figure.
the Baptist.
Wonderful. Amazing.
So
Well,
these are
you,
the two
yeah,
The
these are
Baptist
two
in
paintings of
Louvre.
John the Baptist. Yes, amazing, amazing. So definitely the index finger pointing towards heaven is the one that is Jennifer's favorite. So I really thank you for that. I'm sure she'll be really fascinated to hear this particular point. You mentioned Dan Brown and The Last Supper, and I have to say that the Dan Brown movies, were so such a huge part of popular culture, Mahbhai, that I didn't know that that wasn't actually Mary Magdalene that was on the shoulder of Jesus. So I really thought it was it was her, but you just said that it's not. So that's amazing. Let's move forward with another topic of discussion, Mahbhai, and that one is with regards to the Eiffel Tower. So, Gustav Eiffel, as we all know, he constructed both the Eiffel Tower as well as the base for the Statue of Liberty. So, can you help us understand what was his motivation for creating a structure like that and to have it in the middle of Paris? What was the thinking behind that? Please help us understand that.
Yeah, that was the 100 year celebration, centennial celebration of French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, they had some tragic defeats
Mm-hmm.
in their history, like the Franco-German War. They miserably got defeated in this war, and what gave rise to these was a sense of French nationalism, that we people are French. We have a very long heritage, we have a very long history of art and so many things. So they wanted to create a structure that will be monumental and
Mm.
that will amaze the whole world, that look, the French people has built
Mm.
such a
Something
monument.
monument. Yeah, absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and according to French, practice, for the big
Mm.
piece of monuments, they always go for a competition.
Mm.
Like you people submit your project, and we will finalize, or we will um, uh, take one or two pieces of work, then we will finalize who is going to get the commission.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
Gustav Eiffel, basically, he was an engineer
Mm.
and he has built so many bridges, railway bridges across the globe and also in France. He had the Eiffel Tower was inaugurated in the year 1889,
Mm.
exactly 100 years after the French
French
Revolution.
Revolution.
He was familiar with the weight distribution of structures like railway bridges. So he thought that I should try a structure which will be a bit familiar with the railway bridges, with whom with which I am familiar. So the challenge was it will be a big structure. There is a chance of falling
Mm.
on the head of the people or over the houses
Mm.
that the Parisians were afraid of at that time. Number two, that the structure he is going to build has to be a stable structure. It has to endure centuries. So it has to be beautiful. So
Mm.
considering all of these, what he did actually, he redefined the Garaviviaduct
Mm.
bridge, which I have given a sketch on my book to
Right.
understand it. If you cut it in the middle and
Right.
rejoin it, it becomes an Eiffel Tower.
Wow. That is absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I cannot tell you how much I have learned from the book with regards to certain structures like the Eiffel Tower that I didn't know about before. So I always cherish any book which teaches me something new. And I have to say the granular details that you've got into Mahbubur is absolutely amazing. A related question, Mahbubur, with regards to a structure like the Eiffel Tower, obviously because it is so high, so you have to use an elevator or lift, as we say in Bangladesh, to get to it. And as you know that I work in the Bangladesh lift industry, so it's my bread and butter. I moonlight as a podcaster and a YouTuber, but in my day job, I'm a full-time sales director. So I have to make a living in that way. So my question to you is that I saw a small a part of an article with regards to Elisha Otis, the person who actually invented the lift or the elevator. And is it true that it is actually the Otis elevators which are in the Eiffel Tower? So please tell us about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm, During the construction of Eiffel Tower, as because it was going to be a symbol of French nationalism, so they thought that every piece of material, every piece of technology that will be used there should be, or you could say, must be
Mm.
French.
Right.
So they called few French companies to build an elevator.
Mm.
So at that time, the French technology, elevator for high-rise building is a very difficult job. Most people must have noticed that there's a cable on the top of the elevator which pulls it.
Mm.
So as the height increases, the length of the metallic rope increases. So at the end, it becomes an enormous weight
Mm.
of the cable itself.
Right.
So it's a very difficult job to make an elevator for high-rise buildings and a mega structure like Eiffel Tower at that time. So French companies, they surrendered
Mm.
and the work was given to an American
American
company.
company. Yeah.
American company, which is Otis Elevator. And Otis Elevator was so fascinating in the history of elevators. Before the advent of this company, the elevators was used for lifting cargoes.
Mm.
But people, they don't get into elevators
Right.
because the elevator was not safe at that time. Suppose for any reason, if the cable tears, which means your death sentence.
Mm.
So
Right.
what Elijah Otis did at that time was he invented safety elevator, which was
Mm.
in the year 1852.
Mm.
He invented safety elevator. What do we understand by safety elevator? For any reason, if the cable is torn, the lift will be automatically suspended. Like
Mm. Yeah.
falling 1 or 2 feet, it
Mm.
will be halted
Right.
by its own mechanism.
Mm.
So it was a breakthrough at that time. There was a science, no, not science fair, that was an international trade fair.
Mm.
So they used to call it World Fair, 1853 in New York.
Yeah.
So Otis elevator, they had a stall there, and they had a dummy elevator in front of the stall. When the elevator was taken like 3 stories above, they cut off the roof, and people used to cheer in panic. Then they saw that it didn't fall, and because of the safety mechanism, it was a big gimmick at that time in the World Fair of 1853.
Mm. So it's fascinating story. So Maba, I had a related question with regards to the Eiffel Tower. There's a very famous photo of Adolf Hitler actually, taking a photo with the Eiffel Tower in the background. So how did he end up in Paris, and what year was it, and what was the background behind that particular photo? So please tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. Adolf Hitler, in his youth, actually, he wanted to be an artist,
Mm.
and he gave admission test in art school in Vienna 2 times, and 2 times he was rejected.
Rejected. Mm.
And as history goes on, if you are a defeated person, people will mock at you.
Mm.
And so it happens with Hitler that people used to market him with his artistic capacity, I mean, that he had at that time.
Mm.
People used to mock it, but he was a true artist in his mind. I'm not appreciating about his uh, paintings, and he was artist by his heart. And as of any artist in the world, they always have a dream to visit Paris once in their
Mm.
lifetime.
Lifetime.
That's
Yeah.
true for today also.
Mm.
So Hitler had a desire to visit Paris
Mm.
in his youth,
Right.
but he couldn't do it after Nazi Germany took over France. Hitler took an opportunity to visit Paris,
Mm.
and he went there just as a visitor, and he took two architects with him. One of them is his chief architect,
Right.
Albert
Albert
Speer.
Speer. Yes.
So he thought that it would be useful that if architects were with him, and he had a list of places to visit in France.
Mm.
That was the year 1940
1940.
when
Yes.
Adolf Hitler visited like a tourist
Mm.
in Paris.
Amazing. Yes, indeed. And of course, in that same year, 1940, I believe they also made France sign a surrender document, which was in revenge for what France did to Germany during the First World War. So it's amazing, fascinating stories that are behind these photos. So yes, thank you so much, Maubai, for sharing that. There is one more particular figure, Maubai, that we have to talk about. And of course, there are many movies that have been made about him recently. I am, of course, talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. So, can you tell us something about him that may not be public knowledge? So, for example, I know that he went over to Egypt. He had an expedition there, and then he discovered the Rosetta Stone, and then he came back to Paris, to France. So, maybe there's something about that that you can tell us more about. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. One interesting thing about Napoleon is if you visit the tomb of Napoleon in Les Invalides in Paris, you'd say that uh, his name had no title, like whether he was a general, he was an emperor.
Mm.
So even today, the people used to get shaky calling his name. For the convenience, they call him Napoleon.
Mm,
But whether he was an emperor or he was a general, many there are people they don't want to call him emperor. So during the time of uh, Napoleon III, he was his nephew. Although he was his nephew, but he was afraid to use the title emperor in
mm.
his tomb. He was so
Right.
afraid to do it. So it was without title, just the
Just
Napoleon
the name
Bonaparte
Napoleon
in
Bonaparte.
his
Wow.
tomb. And uh, during the lifetime of Napoleon, he had many, I mean, miseries
Mm,
about his origin, about his nationality, as because he was a Corsican.
mm,
So French people, they didn't consider him
as
as a
French.
Parisian.
Parisian,
And
right.
sometimes people ask that why did he marry a elder person who was uh, 6 years
Mm,
older than him, and he was married before. She was a widow, and she had two children.
mm,
So, why did Napoleon Bonaparte marry such a person? The reason is number one, she was Parisian. Number two, she was born into aristocracy and she was the widow of a general. So,
mm,
she had access to the aristocracy of the Paris. So,
mhm,
Napoleon thought that it was not easy for him to go into marriage into an aristocratic family because of his origin.
mhm,
So he thought that this woman would be a good choice for me.
mhm. Right. Fascinating. I didn't know about that. I think that it's also probably not public knowledge that, for the lay audience, that he wasn't actually born inside France territory. So he was born outside, so on an island. So,
I have to one add one more thing about
sure.
Napoleon.
Yeah.
The year Napoleon Bonaparte was born, just 1 year before that, Corsica was purchased by France. The
Mm.
emperor at that time was Louis XV.
Louis 15.
So,
Yes.
as because they purchased Corsica,
Yeah.
Corsica became part of France. And with the birth, Napoleon got the citizenship
Citizenship
of
of France.
France.
Yeah.
That's why he ended up in cadet college, a
Mm.
school like our cadet college, and
Right.
he ended up in military school without without devoid of that historical event. He would not end up as a
As
general,
a
as an
general.
emperor.
Yeah, exactly. Fascinating, fascinating. So let me just conclude by saying that for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. If you are watching this episode on YouTube, please be sure to give a like on this video and to share it, and to continue to support the channel. The episode will also be available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, so you can download it there as well. Let me just grab the book from behind me. So the book, once again, is Letat C'est moi by Dr. Mahbubur Rahman. It's a fantastic book. I cannot praise it enough. The amount of detail and the picture quality and everything, the publication, everything was wonderful. It's currently available only in Bengali, but I'm sure that an English version will come out very soon. So please do watch out for that. And if you are comfortable with Bengali, then please go ahead and get the book. Or if you're not, then do please wait for the English version to come out. Mao Bhai, my thanks to you as well. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I've learned so much from the book. And I continue to learn from you personally every single day. Thank you very much for your time. I really hope to have you back for a future episode as well.
I should also thank you because of the level of academic discussion we have done here today. Because uh, in Bangladesh, I have given few television interviews. And
Mm,
what is the culture over there? They take your interview without reading the book. I gave those interviews, but I was not happy with it, with those interviews. But today's discussion was actually academic,
mhm.
and we have discussed few things in detail. So I feel so honored and delighted to be a guest of today's session. My heartfelt gratitude for you. So So we will meet again and we will talk again about this book and other things. Thank you very much.
Definitely. Thank you once again, Maubai, for your kind words. So let's catch up soon and have a good day. So.